Hello, mammals!
Hi, Buck!
Hi!
Bye, Buck!
Ice Age Collision Course, the currently last Ice Age movie, which followed the cast having to prevent a meteor from wiping out pretty much all life on the planet, while also having great family and romantic turmoil for everyone, aside from Diego. He's doing pretty alright in comparison to someone who consistently couldn't find love, and someone who forgot their anniversary and claimed mysterious fireworks going off as his plan, before that turns into a meteor shower that almost kills everyone. Yeah, Diego's doing really good. This movie is certainly something, and is arguably the weakest movie out of the 5. It has the weakest villains by far, is filled with pop culture references that don't at all match the nature of the films before it, especially the first 3, but despite that, another movie is releasing next year. That's probably a shocker to a lot of you because I had no knowledge of this at all until someone in my live stream for this game had brought up how I feel about Ice Age 6 happening, and I was extremely confused. But apparently plans for one have existed since Collision Course came out, and a lot of time passed due to Blue Sky Studio shutting down and it now being made by 20th Century Fox. And it will be a whole decade since the last one, which is crazy to think about. What's even crazier is that in the middle of that, this game released in 2019 to the surprise of everyone because it was not released alongside a movie, which is not the norm for license-based games. And a license-based game for a movie at this point in time was starting to become rather rare. So, of course, my interest was piqued, and it only took me 6 years to look into it. And for 2 years of that, I wasn't posting anything. Well, today I'll be looking at Ice Age Scrat's Nutty Adventure because it's better late than never, I suppose. Scrat is looking for a place to put his acorn, and in doing so, has managed to get it locked away in an ancient temple. A mysterious voice tells him that this has activated the challenge of the Scratazons, to find the mightiest champion who will find the crystal nuts scattered throughout the land. And so, Scrat goes throughout the world of Ice Age in order to find the crystal nuts. Now, you might notice that this doesn't really resemble the plot of any of the Ice Age movies, and that's because it isn't based on any one movie. It instead is just based on the overall Ice Age world, which is different in comparison to the previous games. The main indicator of this is that Scrat runs into a few characters from the different movies who mostly act as bosses in the game. The 4th and 5th movie don't get any representation in that department though, which is odd. There's also the crystal and alien stuff, which isn't much of a thing until Collision Course. Now, there is the problem that lore-wise this makes my head hurt the more I think about it, because if it's after Ice Age 2, these two shouldn't be alive, but if it's during Ice Age 2, pretty much anything after Ice Age 2 that is represented shouldn't be there, but I'm choosing to ignore that because A, the plot differences in Arctic games already drove me up a wall, and I'm not doing that again for Ice Age, and B, I just talked about how this game is largely based on Ice Age as a whole rather than looking at any one part of it. Regardless, the story is simple enough to work for a Scrat game, but I will say that the game ends very abruptly. Because even though you see Rudy, she's not the final boss, who you would expect to be the final boss considering the bosses before were other Ice Age characters, and instead it's a nondescript dinosaur, which is very lame. But right after you see Rudy, the game ends with a female alien Scratazon showing up. And then the credits roll. That's actually just how that happens. There's no real satisfying ending for the game. The original task that you had isn't even completed. Scrat does not get the acorn back. And this is probably the most sudden ending to any license-based game I played, which is saying a lot considering how many I've played so far. Overall, the plot is serviceable, but it definitely still has issues despite that. So, right off the bat, looking at this footage, does this look like a PS4/PS5 game to you? Because it doesn't to me. Now, after some extra research, aka looking at other videos for the game, I'm gonna assume that some of the things I'm about to talk about is because I used a PS4 disc on a PS5 and played the free downloadable PS5 upgrade version for this review. Because when I look anywhere else, I don't see some of the cursed things that I've seen. With that said, there are some things that I feel the Ice Age 3 game does better. Even the Ice Age 2 game, an almost 20-year game at this point, does better presentation-wise than this game. For instance, I think Scrat consistently looks better in Ice Age 3. Polygon-wise, this game is the best he's ever been, but it's also the first time that he's been visibly fluffy, which makes sense, he's always had some fluff to him, but it looks kinda weird at times. At a distance, this additional fluff is almost not noticeable, but then for close-ups, it is very noticeable and therefore makes it seem kinda off. Maybe it's because no other game has done it at this point, but to me, even with the lower polygon count, the consistent look of Scrat in the previous games makes it better for me. But it's not just that makes Scrat looks weird. This game has a variety of technical issues. Some of it is a little nitpicky, like the grass textures having a shadow effect on nearby water when they are overlaid, and some random gaps in terrain, but at the same time, this isn't even an issue in Ice Age 2 to my knowledge, so I will be critiquing that harder. But the lighting is horrible. Some textures just randomly flickering, other textures in some areas have their lighting completely changed based on the camera's rotation. That's not even mentioning how some interactable objects in Scrat are sometimes just way brighter than other things, while also having a different lighting change issue. And then in the worst case scenario, and if you have epilepsy, I recommend you look away for a little bit, but what I like to call the epilepsy slalom, which randomly flashbangs you with the brightest light known to man. I genuinely have no idea how this happened, but my eyes were violated basically the entire part of this minigame. Now, aside from that, there is one major thing that I noticed throughout the game, and that there is pretty much no NPCs in this game. If it isn't an enemy, and if it isn't Scrat, it practically doesn't exist. Depending on the area, the only living things in the game that is not grass or trees are a few mammoths, some pterodactyls, and apparently brachiosaurs, which I didn't even notice while I was playing this live, and that's probably because they blend in really well with the trees in the area they're in. Thank you, Zaid Nail, for pointing that out, but it ends up making the world feel super empty since there's not much else to really see. This is especially bad in this game since this is the only game in the series that doesn't have the main cast in any capacity, which should leave room for other characters or animals to be present, which is what Ice Age 2 does while still having the main cast take a back seat. Speaking of no main cast, the only voice actor in this game is Chris Wedge for Scrat. Not surprising since he's reprised the role for literally everything Scrat has ever been involved with, and he's done a great job since then, including with this game. But it does put more emphasis on the emptiness of the world since there's only one voice in the game. Lastly, we have the music, which is made by Alistair Brimble, who has worked on video game soundtracks since the 1980s. He's worked on a lot of stuff, mostly Amiga and Game Boy games, with some Super Nintendo exceptions here and there. The soundtrack is actually pretty good, but personally is not beating the soundtrack for the game of Ice Age 3. That game is kinda unmatched music-wise for the Ice Age series. The biggest fault with this game's soundtrack is that I could only really say that the soundtrack was good after listening to the soundtrack outside of the game, rather than noticing it while I was playing it. I literally listened to the soundtrack while I was typing up this section of the review, and this was one of 2 times where I had headphones on while I was playing the game. The previous time was for the first Ice Age game on Game Boy Advance, which I was emulating. So it's really bad if this is the only game where I didn't notice that. I think one of the big problems is that there were times where music wasn't playing, which ends up making gameplay become awkward because you're kind of waiting for something to fill the silence that you are now aware of, and a lack of music is very noticeable when you really don't want it to. This has happened with another game that I've reviewed way in the past, but let me tell you, it is just as noticeable now as it was back then. As Scrat, you'll be traversing around the world while fighting against various enemies. By default, Scrat has grounded and aerial melee attacks as well as a ground pound and rock/snowballs that he can throw at enemies. For platforming, he's also able to crawl along any wall that has purple crystals inside of them, and wall jump against 2 walls facing each other. As you progress through the game, you'll gain additional abilities that you will use to advance further. This includes a double jump, which you should know what a double jump does, the Scratapult, allowing you to slingshot yourself through these floating rings in order to cross large gaps, and telekinesis, allowing you to move large blocks. There are some doors that will need to be opened, which you can do by either throwing projectiles at switches in the correct order, or picking up some screws and slamming them into these specific slots. Around the world are various collectibles that you can pick up. There's some statues and tablet pieces, as well as purple crystals that are dropped from defeated enemies, broken boxes, and just scattered throughout the areas you explore. The purple crystals are put towards the different pieces of concept art that you can view. One thing that I will give a leg up with this game over Arctic games is that there is enough stuff in the game to do so that it will last longer than watching one of the movies. Even while keeping an eye out for stuff, I'm almost certain that there was stuff that I just flat out missed, but regardless of that, there is a fair amount of things you can't access until you unlock the final area of the game due to the powers being unavailable to you at the time. which does give you a bit more content to work with than Arctic games. All the statues, the tablet pieces, and the concept art that you can unlock all at least give you some form of reason to go back to the game, which again is something that Arctic games lacked. However, if you couldn't tell, the only compliments I've given so far is that it is doing what Arctic games didn't, which is the bare minimum, but even then, this game arguably still doesn't reach that. For starters, combat is, for the most part, terrible. Melee attacks are far too snappy, and the amount of times I have missed a grounded attack on something that is right in front of me gets to a point where it is frustrating to try and use it. Ground pounding and aerial attacks are far better, but fighting enemies in general isn't fun, and kind of pointless for the most part, because all you ever get for beating them are the crystals, which you find everywhere else. By the time I was a third through the game, I had gotten all the crystals I needed for all of the concept art in the game, and that was while I was fighting a fair amount of enemies. I'm almost certain that if you go back to previous areas after getting additional abilities, you can probably get enough crystals while only ever fighting bosses. And in case it's not already clear by whatever footage I've used before this point, this game is very buggy. You can rather easily get stuck in some animations where you do some actions too early out of other actions. And you can get out of it, but it's not exactly easy. Anytime it happened to me, I kinda just got out of it on accident. Also, the first boss fight didn't even work properly the first time I fought it. It worked fine for all but the final part. You're supposed to aim these rhinos at this wall before they run at you and dodge out of the way. There's also some other parts where you avoid taking damage from them, which every boss does, but that's not where the problem is. For some reason, on the last wall bang, the boss would run straight through the wall they are supposed to crash into and get stuck on the other side of the wall, doomed to bash their head against the wall they just passed through for eternity. Most of the time their health bar didn't change for them to be hittable again, not that it mattered since it seemed that I couldn't hit the boss with throwables regardless, so I had to leave the level all the way to the main menu and then go back in and refight the entire fight, and luckily it functioned normally that time. Thankfully, the other boss fights weren't like this, but considering how the rest of the game was just prone to falling apart under your feet if not violating my eyes with its lighting, I had to constantly worry about the other two bosses randomly not working properly. Also, to add on to all of that, the camera sucks. You spend more time fighting the camera than the enemies in this game because you could so much as tap a direction and it feels like it goes flying, which makes it difficult to control if you want to turn a direction quickly while not overreaching. This becomes a major problem when the camera is up against a wall as your vision becomes limited and at times feels uncontrollable. Not to mention, you can only change how the camera turns on one axis, and you can't change how fast the camera moves either. So hopefully you aren't like me and traditionally play third-person games with double inverted camera controls, because for a 2019 game, you don't have that option, which is crazy to know that that's a thing for a PS4 game. I really wish I could move in all directions for the telekinesis powers. Even though Scrat can move in all directions, the blocks you move around can only go forward and back from the side you started moving that block on. Letting you just move it freely would overall make going through these sections faster with less activations, but the other powers do feel good to use, especially using the slingshot in the air. That's pretty fun to do, especially when you're able to chain them together multiple times. The double jump I'm very indifferent about, mainly because that's just kind of a standard for platformers for the most part, so having that as an unlockable is just a little underwhelming compared to the other two. Also, a little side thing that this game actually does better than the Ice Age 3 game, the reticle is a lot more consistent. It is actually entirely accurate all the time, so that is really good. One thing I am a bit harder on though, is that this game puts reminders of how to play the game on screen way too often. If you couldn't tell by how short the gameplay section was, this game is extremely simple. There's not a lot to it. I don't need to be reminded about how to move if I'm standing still for a couple of seconds. Imagine that you want to look around in the environment and then the game essentially tells you to get a move on already. I wanted to give credit where it's due, but apparently the game itself doesn't want me to. These pop-ups are distracting at best and annoying at worst, but not as annoying as fighting the camera or having a whole boss fight just randomly not work. Which isn't that great of a thing if the compliment I'm giving is, yeah, you're bad, but those guys are worse. All in all, it's a bit of a mystery as to why this game exists. It released years after Collision Course came out, which is not a normal trend for license-based games. It's based generally on the Ice Age series rather than one movie, which I don't at all have a problem with, but it manages to feel rather barren, despite most of the bosses being characters from the movies, because outside of that, there's basically nothing else that really represents Ice Age that well. And on top of that, from my experience, it was a buggy mess from a visual and gameplay perspective, which is very bad no matter the console generation, but for a PS4/PS5 game, I do expect better. And I can see why they made a Scrat game as opposed to following a specific movie, mostly Collision Course since that was the only one that didn't have a game. It allows for more freedom on what to do story-wise unless you do a simple platformer with a heavier focus on just one character and their mechanics, similar to the Ice Age 2 game, but that carries the weight of having to be at least as good as that game. But when played side by side, this game pales in comparison in almost every category to the one that came 13 years before it. I highly doubt another Ice Age game will happen once the 6th movie comes out, but given how the last 2 games have been, I don't even think I want one, which is sad. And it's probably one of the main reasons why there just aren't that many license-based games nowadays, outside of the big names.